Okay, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Our panel tonight is on software, and we have a great set of panelists here to lead the discussion. We're going to talk a little bit about platforms, a little bit about people. We're going to hold our discussion to about 30 minutes, so then we can open it up to all of you, so we get a chance to talk about what you want to talk about. And I think I'll just introduce quickly the panel. We have Max Levchin, who is CEO and founder of Slide, and has previously been the CTO and founder of PayPal, and is currently the chairman of Yelp. We have Hendrik Speck, who is the professor of digital media at the University of Applied Sciences in K-Town, also known as Kaiserslautern, is that right? And Hendrik has done a lot of research on next generation search engines, next generation information retrieval, visualization, and he's also studied platforms, Facebook, Google, the iPhone, how do the different audiences behave. And then we have Daniel Ek, who is the CEO and founder of Spotify, who has been a lifelong entrepreneur, founding his first company at age 14. He's founded auction sites, advertising sites, and also ran uTorrent, which was the #1 client on BitTorrent. And then we have Suhas Gopinath, who is the world's youngest entrepreneur. He started his first company, coolhindustan.com, at age 12, and now runs global services, which handles a lot of IT consulting. And when I was doing research on Suhas, I found out that he actually had issues when he was too young to sign contracts on behalf of his company, and he would occasionally lose deals. And chatting backstage, he also let me know that during that time, the same time he was losing the deals because he couldn't sign the contracts, his professor was applying to work for him. And then we have Joel on software, Joel Spolsky, who has run the legendary site talking all about software design and software process. He's also the founder of Fog Creek Software, and which of course produces FogBugs, which is a great project management software tool. So we have a great panel, and I'd like to start off tonight talking about platforms. What are some of the new platforms that really matter? What are some of the prediction factors for success? And I thought I would ask the first question of Hendrik, which is on the audience research he's done around Facebook, Google, some of the predominant platforms of today. What are some of the user needs and user trends that people are seeing on those platforms?
I mean, as I'm not here on a company ticket, I can more or less... Am I loud enough? Okay. As I'm not here on a company ticket, I can more or less speak freely. So, I mean, what we do in general is, I mean, we crunch numbers. So what we do is we crawl a bunch of platforms, get 5 million users from Facebook or 5 million users from MySpace, and analyze their behavior, analyze what they are doing there, analyze what is really going on there. And to put it rather simple, I mean, it can explain partially why, for instance, a campaign from Obama is more successful than, let's say, McCain. Or it can explain why a YouTube campaign from the Israeli army failed compared with other opposing channels there on YouTube. So what we are trying to figure out there basically are what is really social. I mean, what do people do there? How do they react? And what does it really take to create a product or create a message or a channel that is rather successful? And I mean, Mr. Thibault was already pointing it out before. Sharing is certainly one of these essential criteria.
Well, so the rest of our panelists have all built things for these platforms. So I guess I wanted to throw out the question to them in terms of, you know, what factors and what needs do you see from the users? What types of trends have surprised you? What platforms are you building for now? So, do you want to go ahead and start, Joel?
Sure. I guess I'm the most surprised because at the time that I started my company, we believed that there was still going to be Windows would still continue to be a viable platform, and that you could develop software for Windows and just connect it to the internet or connect it to the web. And that turned out not to be true. You know, for a long time, later than anybody else, I thought that the user interface advantages of a rich Windows or a rich Macintosh client would outweigh the benefits of being on the internet. And I didn't really understand these, you know, email programs on the web and editing programs on the web. Because they always had horrible, clunky user interfaces relative to the Windows Mac world. And lo and behold, we discovered that most people just don't care if the interface is kind of clunky. And those of us that develop software for Windows and Mac had gotten so used to developing very, very beautiful user interfaces that were very, very smooth and very, very slick, and with all kinds of keyboard shortcuts and just ease of use baked in ways that were absolutely impossible to do in HTML. Although increasingly it's becoming easier to do with Ajax and so forth. And we were convinced that people would always go for the rich email client, the rich Photoshop. There's never been a Photoshop on the web. There still hasn't been a great Photoshop equivalent on the web, but there probably will be. And I think that's a mistake. And now what I see is that it's almost impossible to find developers developing for the Windows platform anymore. If anything, they'll make a plugin or something, but they'll just do the absolute minimum Windows work necessary and put everything else behind a web server. Even if that means that there are entire categories of software that are not being created because they're not possible in a web browser interface. So the platforms do sort of shift in surprising ways.
So will we have a Photoshop on the web anytime soon?
Are you looking at me?
Sure. Max, who's doing slideshows and things with photos on the web,
yes,
might be our
I
most
think,
likely candidate.
I guess I'm on the stage probably the closest person to lay claim to the idea of Photoshop on the web. We certainly don't have an offering that's anywhere near Photoshop complexity and quality. Reality is, it's not clear to me Photoshop has to be on the web ever, because the people who use Photoshop are so specialized that they are in fact willing to go through the hurdle of downloading something or buying it in a store, God forbid, and actually installing it on their computer, which I don't think happens to anyone anymore except for extreme specialists. The reality is, or one of the realities of this shift from the desktop to the web is that the cost of software development has gone down a ton, and the cost of varying the user interface and skinning the same functionality that used to be only possible to deliver in a shipped product can now be sliced and diced into very, very thin offerings that are literally as trivial as, let's black and white this photo, and 50,000 other filters that are available in Photoshop are completely irrelevant. Just go to the blackandwhitemyphoto.com, and that's enough. And so that's, among things of that nature is what we do. And on the surface, it sounds silly, but it allows for intense variation of offerings, and therefore attracts hundreds of millions of people, which is something that we've seen in our products.
So to Suhas, you work on both consumer software and enterprise software. So what do you see in terms of the overall trends for really complicated applications?
Yeah, Rakesh, I mean, one of our first product when we started our company was school management system, and where where we used to install it in the schools, and in case if the school kid was not in the school, it used to send an SMS to the mom's mobile phone. Okay, fine, your son has not come to the school. So we shifted from the Windows-based application to the web-based, and of course it was certainly an opportunity for us to market and for us to enhance the sales. And at the same time, I feel that. To set up another Web 2.0 site, or to set up another social networking site, I thought maybe we could set up something like a web-based operating system, and of course it is something which we are working on at the moment, which is intuitive based, and at the same time it has certain APIs where anybody could make applications on the web-based operating system, which we will be launching in March.
And speaking of the web-based operating system, Daniel, I know you've done a lot of development with things that are essentially cloud computing, also a lot of peer-to-peer work. What do you see as some of the trends in terms of what types of apps users want in web versus native?
I think one of the things that we noticed is the power of drag and drop. And I mean, drag and drop in web-based applications still is, it's not impossible, but it's kind of hard to do. And I still see that one of the great things about what we do is that people actually tend to kind of passively listen to music, of course, which is kind of good, but they also kind of actively search for artists and stuff. But context switching on web-based software is still kind of hard. I mean, if you're writing an email, yeah, you can go to another tab as well, but a lot of users, still search for to find a website, to type that into Google and think that's the same as actually remembering the domain name. So, my point with that is definitely that context is kind of hard to do, and music is still something that you kind of want on always. And the other thing, of course, if you can manage to do the integration between platforms such as devices and the cloud, that's something powerful that a lot of people haven't done.
Well, I think that brings us to the next question, which is the platforms of today, right? The web, iPhone, Facebook. What are some of the platforms that you're most excited about? And I think one of the key questions here is, can you predict the success of various platforms? When you, as developers and founders of companies, what are you looking for in a new platform to understand whether or not this is going to be something that's worth building on or not, something that will be easy to develop on?
I'll take it. I have my laundry list going right now. I think the predictability of platform success is probably not the easiest thing in the world, but there's certain things that have emerged as very strongly liked by developers. So the theme, if you will, in the latest set of platforms that have launched in the last 3-4 years has been cheap distribution or free distribution. So up until MySpace really sort of, as far as we know, accidentally allowed HTML inclusion in their pages, the notion of now I got to get me some customers actually meant now I got to get me some money before I can go and advertise and buy customers. By way of HTML injection and then made more sophisticated with Facebook's APIs and then sort of an attempted playing up with OpenSocial, which Google sponsors and leads, and many other platforms that have emerged, this notion of now you can just have your customers by the millions, essentially free, was introduced. So that's the free or cheap distribution is the single biggest new thing that has happened probably since Windows, as far as I can tell. The other side, though, that has been painfully obvious is that distribution isn't enough. The only reason to have distribution is to have revenue. To have revenue, you have to have a well-defined, clear path to, now that you have these hundreds of millions of users, here's what you can do with them. And to me, the single most exciting development that happened in the platform world was the launch of the App Store, because it was the first platform that came in with, oh yeah, distribution was already there, but they basically said, we expect such quality from developers that you could charge for the content. Up until that point, the view was, you got to make some money off the ads. That's why you get your 100 million users. The problem with that is the owners of the platform are inherently in a conflict with developers, which is an okay thing to have in a really, really young system, but only if the platform itself makes a ton of money. The reason Windows is never quite scared of the Windows client developers is because they make $400 on average per client of their operating system. Facebook and MySpace and all the OpenSocial supporters are ultimately in a vague conflict with developers, and therefore another interesting way to monetize any of those platforms is charging consumers directly. Apple came in and said, hey, you know what? We're going to make charge for your software one of the dominant pieces, if not the dominant piece, and to make that happen, we're going to give you a checkout counter, and we're going to give you a billing relationship, and we're going to give you a credit card to charge every time somebody likes the piece of software that you make. So I think the path to direct from consumer monetization is probably the interesting bright light that's lighting up at this point.
I think what you're saying is right in that a platform has to offer its developers a distribution channel, some kind of distribution channel, a way of reaching users in order to attract the small developers. I mean, I started my website on Dave Weiner's platform, editthispage.com, which was an early blog publishing platform. And the only reason to use that tool, I don't know if anybody ever tried to use Dave Weiner's software, but the only reason to use that tool is that Dave sat there and watched things that people were doing with the tool, and if they were good, he linked to them. And so it was just a way to get links from Dave Weiner and to establish an initial audience, which I then had to somehow move off to my own domain name at a later stage, in order to own my own audience. And it's a good thing I did that. But I think that we should probably just forget the Apple Store. I don't think that's a real platform. I think the iPhone App Store is a bunch of baloney. I don't think anybody can make money with 99-cent apps that they developed in 3 days. If they are making money with 99-cent apps that they developed in 3 days, next week there will be 250,000 identical apps. If you go and try to find a farting application right now on the App Store, there probably are already so many that the chances that you'll find the one that we all know about is the famous farting application that made millions of dollars.
I think you're just scared of competition, Joel. So,
in other words, if there's no barrier to entry, that applies to your competitors just as well.
This is completely unsubstantiated, but if I remember correctly, Apple reported something like $100 million of developer fees collected from the App Store platform. I don't remember the exact period of time, but I think they take something like half the money that developers make. There's the other half that has gone into pockets of real developers. Now, they could be professional developers, but those are professional developers that never had to pay for audience. That's a huge savings.
Daniel Suhas is the Apple Store real?
Yeah, sure. I think so. But I was actually wanting to ask Max here. So, you know, the way I look at you guys is that you're still relying on advertising. So how do you actually, if you like the App Store and you like the fact that you can charge users directly, how do you think Slide will?
In other words, are you asking me why am I not practicing what I preach?
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to preach than practice. You have to make things that are good enough to charge. No, I'm kidding. I believe that every single app we make is good enough to charge. Well, I think the barriers to developers to get into the world of charging for applications are substantially higher than making money from advertising. And so the decision to go into ad-driven content essentially was the right one because it allowed us to start making money right away. As soon as we had the audience, which was a lot easier to come by than 5 years ago, we could then offer interesting solutions. And the reason large developers, I mean, to attack my own claim of best money is the money paid from consumers, is that young developers suddenly in possession of a huge audience are, at least for a while, and we're certainly in that while, willing to invent new ad types, basically what's known as the new media types. And so you could go into an advertising agency and say, well, even though we're not quite as big as Google or not quite as big as Yahoo, we're willing to work with you and make a really interesting offering for your advertising needs. Mm-hmm. So long as you have that advantage, you can make real money in advertising. Over time, you will have competition from other people that are smaller that will say, and we will turn our app upside down and call it Nike app for a week, which we won't do because we're a little bit too big for that now. So I'm not claiming that the App Store model is the only model. The App Store model is brilliant because it allows the platform to essentially extract tax from developers, which every really good platform ultimately winds up being a taxation mechanism that gives everything away and charges as the money comes in.
Well, Windows never extracted tax from any developers.
They could.
They couldn't?
They could.
They could have? I don't know. They probably wouldn't have been successful if they had tried.
I think they...
I mean, even before anybody had Windows, Microsoft would give developers free Windows runtimes to distribute with their apps so that developers could write Windows apps and make them available to customers that didn't have Windows.
The way Microsoft charges its tax is through the sale of the hardware when the operating system is bundled. So it doesn't make sense for you to pay for Windows 10 times if you have 10 different apps running on your desktop. But when you bought your computer, because Windows has already been bundled in the box, you've paid the $400 or $300 bundle tax.
But all else being equal, if you were a developer and you had a choice of developing for Android where there is no tax versus developing for, let's say, iPhone where there is, wouldn't you rather develop for Android?
I would rather develop for the operating system, which is what these things ultimately are, where I have the
most users.
Maximum of the product of the following two variables: number of users, revenue possible per user, per unit time. So whatever's in that rectangle, the biggest one, that's the one I want to work for.
To be fair, I think the App Store charging, what is it, 30%, that's actually a fairly reasonable cut given what they're doing.
Yeah, if you look at the mobile carriers that extract 50% of every transaction by essentially providing a strong billing relationship and a collection system, App Store is quite reasonable.
Yeah.
Of course, App Store is competing with carriers and trying to disintermediate them fundamentally because the charges go through iTunes, so there's a reason why they're willing to essentially dump in that market.
Suhas, do you have views on how you can make money from some of the developer efforts in the consumer or enterprise space?
Yeah, of course. I entirely agree what Max told. That is, I think the platform should act like a bridge between the end users and also the app developers, so that you're able to monetize it, and also it could be on subscription base. So, like in this next venture that we're going to launch, we have our own app store, in where we have encouraged the app developers to make applications using our APIs, and at the same time. Of course, one of the main issues is that when we approach app developers, they say that, okay, fine, we want to see the user base to make apps on your platform. So, and at the same time, if I need to attract the user base, I should also show them some apps. So it's like, so it is one of the major issues that we face. But yeah.
And Hendrik, I know you've studied the users of these platforms. We talked about what makes a platform popular with developers. What makes a platform popular with users? And the two are obviously intertwined in an ecosystem.
Actually, I kind of like the discussion. I mean, I'm not representing a platform, so I don't really have to defend myself, which makes it a lot easier. And I think there are two trends that are currently happening right now. Number one is, I mean, we go away from a traditional software development model through the development of APIs, through the opening of mesh apps, open social and co, to finally allowing a completely different development model that I would actually call social development or something like that, where you have a real problem because you lose the property of the software where you have been involved with once the mass or the result of the mass becomes significantly higher than the initial value that you put in. This is number one. And number two is certainly that from all the, I would say, 12, 13, 16 business models that you could actually run on the internet, we see that only very few of them have survived. I mean, only very few institutions are still relying on subscription. I mean, I still remember the hype 10 years ago. I mean, people will pay for high quality content. New York Times was thinking that. And they changed back very quickly. Now we see a hype for advertising. We also see that, especially in Europe, we have, for Mozilla or Firefox, we have user rates of roughly 30 to 40% in Germany, for instance. Now the most downloaded add-on for Firefox or Mozilla is AdBlock Plus. I mean, I enjoy your website simply because I'm not bothered by any advertising that you might put in my face. So I can actually get the most out of your platform because I enjoy the functionality, if I would use it. Mm-hmm. So, but that really raises some question. I mean, what happens when you put everything basically in one basket? I mean, what happens with all the other business models? I mean, that part of the subscription idea I really like, but we also see that increasing competition, especially in the mobile phone market, might pose a substantial threat to the Apple iPhone store.
So I'll jump in here because business model is an interesting question. It's coming from Max anyway. So gadgets, widgets, Facebook apps, how do you make money off of them?
You don't. There's no money in widgets, so please don't enter into my business. It's terrible. I don't need any more competitors. No, I'm kidding. There are sort of two fundamental ways you can make money in any business. Someone has to pay, ultimately, for my developers to come to work and get their sponsored lunches and Adwala juices. So it's either you with your willingness to tolerate advertising and it's being sponsored by Nike or McDonald's or whatever brand wants to reach the mass of the consumers that we have, or if you are intolerant of advertising or are in fact a believer in the quality of the content or the quality of software that we're making, that you would in fact subscribe to it and pay a premium fee either on a monthly basis or as a one-off. The thing that's really interesting actually is sort of to get back to what you were saying, there's definitely an amazingly, with this ability to get distribution anytime you like, with more or less unlimited quantity, the standard way of saying, look, we are the biggest thing in the world, we are the New York Times, that's where the content really is, you have to pay subscription, or too bad, there's no other New York Times to subscribe to. In the world of widgets and gadgets, that's not true. I can be as big as the biggest guy so long as I understand the viral optimization and leverage the available APIs as much as possible. And so the guy number two that comes right behind me and says, whatever that Max guy charges you for, I'm going to give away for free until that Max guy isn't in the picture anymore. And so there's real tension between advertising and direct-to-consumer models. The real answer to this real question is being played out right now. One of the things that has been shown to work really well is something that many people have said will never work in the United States and in general in the Western markets is things like virtual currency and virtual goods. The reason that works is because you don't actually want free bag of holding or +5 sword in the free game because it's not the real thing. People pay for World of Warcraft, and World of Warcraft made over $1 billion last year, even though there are many World of Warcraft competitors and clones that come in completely free in the hopes of eventually making money somehow. The brand strength of World of Warcraft in the first place makes an enormous difference, but even bigger difference is the fact that what you pay for in the software where premium content sustains itself is the status. You're actually not buying pixels. Everybody understands that pixels are essentially as valuable as the salary of the artist that made the picture of the thing you're buying. The status in the community of your peer players is the thing that ultimately makes money in direct-to-consumer models today anyway. So I'm pretty optimistic about that. I think there's an enormous difference between Asian markets and Western markets. Western markets have yet to show anything above, call it $100 million a year revenue line. So, compared to QQ, which I think broke $1 billion last year in a top line. So there's a bit of a difference between China and US, even though the buying power is exactly opposite. So, but still, direct-to-consumer seems to be the rising star, and the advertising seems to be the declining CPM star.
So there's virtual goods, there's advertising, there's also direct payment from users and subscribers, which is what you have, Daniel, at Spotify. So a lot of people expect software to be free. Are they paying for Spotify? Are they paying for the service?
Yeah, I mean, we actually have a lot of our users that's paying users, but I think essentially, we rely on licensed content, which everyone knows today that you can get music free through any pirate site, or you can get it through iMeme or Lala or anyone else. But I want to extend what Max said, because I totally believe in the social currency. There's lots of things that you can do. Like we're about to actually launch something like annotated playlists, which you can add like pictures and actually description to, this is my favorite tracks, Joel, and I'll send it to you, and you can listen to it. And I'm a paying user, but it's also the status aspect that my playlist appears on of that specific artist. But the other thing is, and this is the really interesting thing about the App Store and possibly about Android as well, is that I still believe that people are willing to pay for things portable. And that's not only music, but it's especially true in the case of music. But I do believe that if you can make the user experience good enough and the packaging good enough, because there's a reason why Slide is bigger than RockU, and it's really because the packaging is better.
Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate that free plug.
Yeah. No, but
Spotify is awesome, by the way. I just wanted to let you know.
No, but really, I still think that everything in the end is about packaging, and I do believe that there's a real gap right now between portable devices, which is getting better and better and better, and the cloud-based services, which of course where distribution is free, because distribution in a mobile environment, as it is today, is still a walled garden with Nokia devices or Sony Ericsson devices and that kind of stuff, which is really big here in Europe.
Well, there's portable devices and there's also portable data. So once people have bought the music, once they've loaded their data into these applications, how free are they to take it where they want to go with it to the next app? This is the same app on the App Store. What are some of the hurdles to data portability and to really letting consumers own their data and be able to take it where they want to go with it?
I don't think anybody cares about, they don't care about data portability until they're wondering, how to export their address book. But then they really only care about exporting their address book. They don't care about data portability as a concept. I don't think people care about privacy in the same way as the privacy advocates who talk a lot and obsess over these things. We still haven't gotten to the point. I could probably put something in the Fogbugs license agreement that says, if you read this far, drop me an email and I'll send you $50, and I probably wouldn't have to pay it. Because you get about 1 out of 1 million people that read those license agreements. And when you Google, you notice it, because you have 50 million users, that's 50 people, 500 million users, that's 500 people that read your license agreement and complained about it. But I think the biggest problem with what was this concept called? Attention trust. This idea that a user kind of owns their gestures. If I visit a website, that's my property. If I search for something, the fact that I'm interested in that thing, buying a washer dryer, is my property, and you don't get to sell it to other people without my permission. This is not something that I think anybody understands in the real world. So we could talk about it at conferences until we're blue in the face, and users are not really going to care.
Hendrik, do you agree? I know you have lots of opinions on privacy.
Are you one of the privacy advocates?
There's a slight urge to oppose. I agree with your statement when you just described the status quo. And I agree with your statement. If you look, let's say, at the privacy settings within social networks, then we realize that up to 90% of the users are simply either not aware or they are simply not using them.
Could you say that again?
The privacy settings in social networks like Facebook are simply not being used. So I absolutely agree with your statement right now.
They are being used. It's just the defaults that are being used. saw. There's a huge difference there.
They're not being used, they're just there.
No. Facebook ultimately controls which privacy settings you're going to make because he can't be bothered to change them. So
That's what I'm saying. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm saying basically what you're describing is the status quo. What I'm assuming, or what we actually see, is that status is changing. I mean, people are becoming more and more aware of privacy violations. I mean, I can speak for Europe.
Really?
And we all know that Americans are more general, more open when it comes to their privacy. This is one thing.
Possibly just Americans believe that nothing can possibly go wrong. I have nothing to hide. I didn't do anything wrong. I cannot possibly be put in a dark prison somewhere because I didn't do anything wrong.
I think that's some sort of post-Patriot Act. They're like, no, you can look at me. I'm okay.
But there's another thing, basically, where you really see where that system doesn't work. And that's not, I mean, just we can actually go back to his example. I mean, ask people what they feel the very same moment when they want to transfer the files from their iPhone, from their iPod, to just a normal, plain MP3 player. Mm-hmm. I mean, just ask them what the pain or the suffering is they are going through at that moment. And then basically, again, going back to one of the terms that he was using before, I think he's looking at it from the wrong side, because he's using a term which makes absolutely sense from his point of view, and that is virtual currency. I would look at it from the consumer point of view, and then again, it is trust. Yeah. It's a completely different point of view, and for me, I must say, the trust in the platform is much more important, because simply when the users are losing the trust, and actually some social networks are experiencing that, or discussions in Europe about Google and co. are still also ongoing, then you might see a significant change, or then you might actually see privacy becoming a value. Privacy gaining a business value.
It could become important one day. I don't, or it might not. I just have trouble. I wish people cared more about the private information. I think Facebook would make an excellent application for the CIA. That would be the application I would build if I was working at the CIA and trying to gather as much data as I possibly could about relationships between people who are likely to cause trouble at some point in the future. And it sort of scares me, but I don't think that's, I think that's a very, very esoteric, a very rare kind of person that has any awareness that there is such a thing to worry about as privacy.
The thing is, only the bad guys encrypt their messages. The unfortunate reality of life. That the only ones who care that their messages might get read. I'm completely with Joel on this one, despite our earlier disagreements. I think people fundamentally really do not care about privacy, unfortunately, which, as somebody who studied crypto most of his adult life before I became an entrepreneur.
I mean, just trying to educate people to use different passwords for every website, it's just an uphill battle.
But it's inconvenient.
It's never gonna happen.
It's so damn inconvenient. And actually, I had a graph somebody sent me one time where it showed the length of password versus your likelihood for being an employee of the CIA, and it's like a straight line. Basically, the longer your password, the more likely you are to be a spook.
Okay, well, we can talk about privacy, I think. Oh, do you want to?
Yeah, actually, just one final remark, and this is actually to everyone. Do you think that's Facebook's big competitive edge against Google, for instance? That, they can utilize your private information much better?
I'm going to have to question the assumption. I don't think Facebook has any advantage over Google. I think that Facebook barely even has a business model, whereas the Google business model is to take all profit from any transaction in the entire world and keep it through an auction mechanism. So if somebody's going to sell, excuse me, Marissa, if somebody's going to sell a washer or dryer on the web, whatever profit they could have made is going to be taken through that auction process of bidding for that keyword on Google. And I've definitely seen it directly. I can very directly measure by taking my click-through rate times the amount. Look up right now on Google bug tracking software and click on the top number one link there, and you're going to cost the folks at Atlassian $8. So I encourage you all to do that now. That's our competition. And they're going to pay $8, and I know that their click-through rate and their conversion rate, if it's anything like a normal click-through and conversion rate, is probably about 1%. And so they're really paying about $800 to acquire a customer for a $1,000 product. And so what I see time and time again in niche markets is that's what Google does, is it's this big sieve that takes as much of the... And now comparing that to Facebook, which the business model is crappy little display ads that have a 1/1000, click-through rate. No comparison. So.
Well, so let's change gears a little bit.
The Google business model is the better one. I'm going to have to say.
Wait until they launch social search.
So let's talk about strategic advantage, because I really believe that at the heart of strategic advantage in software development is the people. I really think that how good your team is really defines how well your software stands the test of time and how well it performs strategically. So when you're recruiting a team, what do you look for? Suhas, did you hire your professor? And who else have you hired, and what do you look for in them?
Like when we started, because we're a self-funded company, so we started from an internet shop in Bangalore, and of course we didn't have enough funds to employ somebody on full time. And at the same time, I felt that we did not have to employ somebody who has finished his bachelor's or master's, so somebody who has the skill sets. And at the same time, I started to look out for some of the school dropouts, or school kids who had the skill set who would have satisfied. So it was something known as crowdsourcing. So we started to employ the individuals who had the skill sets they met with, and of course it was quite easy. Of course, we had to face some of the egoism, because when I started 14 years, and when I had to interview somebody who was this 25 years, it was like of course we had some ego issues where he used to say that, okay, I don't want to work under a school kid. So
What else do you guys look for in excellent teams?
Drive.
Drive? Is that what you
Drive. It's
I think that software development is the good software development. All the things that we talk about as what to differentiate, like how do you make a platform successful? How does World of Warcraft manage to charge money for little tiny bitmaps that you get to use for a few seconds? How does Facebook? Why was Facebook so successful? There's so many other products like Facebook. There was one called thesquare.com. I mean, this was the 943rd product that did the exact thing that Facebook does. And it took off like wildfire. And Yossi talked yesterday about what does it take to be a really popular or a cool application, and nobody really has the answer. And especially who doesn't have the answer is I don't remember anything in my computer science education about anything like that.
That's right.
And so finding the really talented software developers, it's fairly easy to find the people that can plug in an algorithm, or that can even figure out a way to make an existing algorithm more efficient, or that can encode something that you've specified for them exactly. But finding the people that are going to figure out that if you use a slightly different shade of blue, your site will look ever so much trendier, or if you use square corners instead of rounded corners, or rounded corners instead of square corners. Or my personal secret of success is I always use a slightly larger font than everybody else, so we get all the 40-year-olds, which nobody else has. Whether it's on Stack Overflow or Joel on software, I'm always using the 12-point instead of the 11-point.
This is the preach-on, Joel, man. That's exactly right. So seriously, I don't believe there's a school in the top 20 universities in America, at least, that will give you a degree in product management, which is what you're describing. The ability to define product features in a way that makes sense by reenacting what the user will be thinking later is an incredible skill that you only learn in a job. And so you basically have this dichotomy where you can get some of the talent and the skill set in liberal arts students, but they have no idea how to build it, and then you have to teach them computer science, which is very difficult, takes 4 years, and requires a certain amount of grueling work. Or you can take a computer science student that will know exactly how to build it, but they're going to want to build it from command line because that's how they teach you to do things in computer science, and the two shall never meet. So finding people that come in and say, I was a 4.0 GPA in computer science from MIT or U of I or a top-notch school, and I really hate the color you use for your front page. That's great, hire now.
But how involved are you guys in the product? I know for instance, I rather hire lots of smart people around me. Of course, if I can get them with experience, that's even better. But I'm personally quite involved in my product and the features that we're doing. And my guess is, without knowing, that you both, or actually all here, is quite involved in the product. So again, isn't that our strength in the end to know the balance between technology and business and product?
It doesn't scale to be the guy that makes a decision. You ultimately want that pushed down as far as possible because
true, but in a startup.
Even in a startup, the thing that really, just sort of a subtle, but I think a very pointed example, if you get a developer in a startup, it's you and a developer, and you're busy raising money and doing whatever crazy thing CEO does, and the guy is just coding all day long. He's going to be the guy making the UI decision. He's going to be the guy putting it up on the server somewhere. He's going to be the guy typing up the marketing copy on a front page. A product managerially thoughtful person won't make spelling mistakes.
Right.
Someone who's an engineer does not care. Like, look, I made it work.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter that
A
it's
software
misspelled.
developer makes probably 34 product decisions an hour while they're writing code. Every if statement is a product decision of some sort. And they have to have some awareness of those things. It has to be pushed down to that level. It can't be defined by one person and implemented by another. And it really is, I believe, a very, very rare talent, which is why there are so few breakout applications. I think of, for example, if you're building a social network, the skill that you should need to build a good social network is anthropology, ethnographic skills. You have to be the kind of person who sat with users and watched them use social networking products and understand how they work. And so in social networks, the only person I can think of that's qualified as saying that she's done this is Dana Boyd, who's at UC Berkeley and writes about the autistic user interfaces of social networks where you are either friends with somebody or not, which is about as close to autism as I can think of. And in fact, she was very skeptical of these I'm either friends or not kind of binary decisions. And lo and behold, that turned out not to have been the problem. And so the only person who's
Is she
actually
really
qualified to study the ethnography and the anthropology actually probably made what I feel was a wrong call about social networks. So it's extremely hard. Maybe the answer is that we all just develop things at random, and through some kind of Cambrian technology, only one of them survives.
Okay, well, I think we should open up to questions soon, but I'm going to ask one more question, which is actually from downstairs. Last night at dinner, I met Hans Ulrich Obrist, and he was running a panel all on art and architecture, which I got very, very interested in. And then suddenly, in the middle of dinner, we realized that we had the two competing panels. So we resolved to send questions to each other's panels. So I sent a question there to talk about how will software affect and change art and architecture. And the question he wanted to ask our panel is, what is your one dream unrealized software project? So what would you love to see built, or what would you love to build yourself if you had time, energy, interest?
You want to start?
Sure. Kind of a random, long-winded project, but I really did think of doing it. So my theory as to why Apple is so successful at taking a Unix-based operating system, which they took BSD, and made it a bestseller, and actually made it look good and work well, versus every single sorted Linux desktop, which is an outrage. A righteous indignation burns in my heart every time I look at my favorite operating system, and yet it sucks so bad to be a desktop. So I think the real reason is they don't have to write device drivers. They own the hardware shop. They make the best hardware that they want to make. Apple does, and they just screw the software right onto the iron. So if I had a month, I would pick my favorite, hopefully not too failing hardware company like, say, Dell, take a Linux stack, and just rip out all the other device drivers except for the Dell-specific device drivers and try to integrate them as tight as possible and see if I can have a Linux operating system running on a single piece of hardware that does it at least as well as Apple does. So this is a little techie, but...
Just a little.
I have a computer science degree.
I know. I think we all do.
Yeah, in my case, like when I started, I wanted to launch an affordable ERP which could be similar to SAP's, but of course I always felt it very hard to make my own ERP system which could be feasible and which is also marketable to standards of SAP. So it is one of my unrealized softwares now.
Daniel?
To be honest, I don't know. I kind of focus on the next couple of years with my business and try and make it the best possible music company I can.
Oh wait, that's what I was supposed to say
Building
too.
it already. Hendrik, do you have an ideal app you really, really want?
I know already the response. Okay, what I'm currently working on is a fully distributed, hardcore encrypted social network, meaning no single point of failure, no Facebook anymore. User retain control over their data. You can actually outsource your data, but it is encrypted with a public key infrastructure. So all the problems that we are currently experiencing are gone. Unfortunately, advertising too.
He might be a CIA employee. Very long password, I suspect.
The state is paying, so.
I
Joel?
want to know what he was.
Boy. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I think that one thing I'd like to see happen, and I'd like to have time to work on, is the idea of computing that disappears, whatever that may be. So, for example, if let's just look around at how much work it takes to get the audio-visual working at a conference like this, and there are dozens of hardworking audio-visual people here and it's, I can't say that it's working perfectly, even with all those people working on it. And so that seems like, for me, a ubiquitous computing or an invisible computing platform would be something where you're not even aware that amplification is taking place. You're just speaking, and suddenly people are hearing you clearly and more loudly, and there's no user involved. Any kind of situation where, a modern car usually has that phenomenon. A modern car has all kinds of computer chips that are doing things for you, and you don't even know that they're there or notice that it's computerized.
Okay, well, let's take some questions from the audience. Yeah, up here in front to me.
Going back to the topic you began with, which was software platforms. Recently we've seen, and we're about to see more, service providers, telcos, mobile operators coming out with their own platforms, trying to become, create an app store. So the question is, what do you see as the future of these? How might they succeed in light of potential thoughts that you might have otherwise? What's their outcome? Your thoughts?
Yeah, for these other platforms, it just becomes a must-have at some point. There's no way that Nokia can keep up with iPhone if they're not going to have an app store. Just the difficulty of finding the right S60 software or whatever it may be, even though Nokia has great hardware, and the software is out there, it's not centralized, and just finding it and paying for it is sort of a kind of a nightmare. So I think that this has just become a must-have feature for those other platform vendors. And it's, at this point, they're just playing catch-up, and when they have finally caught up, it will just disappear into the woodwork as a feature that everybody has.
It's a little bit like saying, does it make sense, or what will happen to news production agencies like Reuters or CNN or all these places? Will they ever fully embrace citizen journalism? And the obvious answer is yes. It's a lot cheaper to have millions of people out there with phone cameras taking pictures of disasters and sending them in. Like basically consumer contributed content is going to happen in news whether we like it or not, and there's some editorial decisions that will have to be made and sort that out as a business, but the same exact thing will happen on any software platform. Having all your own developers make things for you is just going to be too expensive if you have thousands of willing developers building whatever functionality that they might think is useful for their little niche group. So I think the two are kind of inevitably linked.
I mean, while we eventually agree that there will be the general tendency that they all will have their stores, I don't really see those stores for all the platforms. I see that in a very short amount of time, we see a generalization or standardization of these processes. I mean, there's now a company coming out with an open operating system running on mobile phones. I'm avoiding the name.
I think that's only going to be true if somebody builds a universal checkout counter that somehow figures out a great way to settle all those transactions without sharing the consumer information, because the ultimate advantage for every platform is on one hand the distribution, which they all presumably have, otherwise they wouldn't be a platform. On the other is the billing relationship. If you centralize the store, that means the billing relationships will have to be somehow centralized. It can only be done by a third party. Having done a little bit in third-party centralization of payments, I think it's a pretty tough proposition in the world of mobile, where the credit cards have already been collected.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I mean, if you have reached a critical mass, I mean, from a European point of view, it's quite easy. I mean, when you go to the iTunes store and you realize you have to wait 1 or 2 years before you can actually download the content that's already available in the United States, then you feel the urge actually to try simply something else. And eventually you go to the competitor, and once you reach a critical mass there, I think there's no way to return to the original game. I mean, there will simply no place for yet another company, for yet another operating system running on whatever simple platform.
I think the standardization of the technology is likely. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. There's already 2 very large spinning wheels, and there'll be maybe 4 more, and they'll come down to the same number of operating systems are out there. There's kind of 3 really. But the ownership of the consumer data, specifically the ownership of the billing data or the data for advertising targeting, or whatever data powers the business model for the developer, will be held as tightly as possible by each platform, and the data they share, it'll be amazing, but it'll be outside of my lifetime, I suspect.
I mean, trying to keep it as tightly as possible is a nice phrase. And I mean, what that means, you can see in every newspaper when it again says, This phone has been bricked or broken into, and with an open operating system, it's getting much easier. So I mean, I don't really see that as a barrier.
Well, we got to get Joito back on stage, and he'll tell us how Creative Commons is going to hack the credit card information databases that Vodafone and Comcast have. But until that happens, I think we're probably going to look at the fully decentralized world in terms of app stores and things like that.
Let's take one more question.
Good panel. Marissa, I'd love it if you added your answer to your question about what you look for in great people at Google.
It's funny because I read an article in 2000 that made these 2 points. And I made them again in December, and I realized that Joel has actually named his book 2 points of what I look for. And so it's a common meme. You look for smart people who get things done. Because if you hire people who lack one or the other, you have a problem. It's obvious, right? Smart people who don't do things, people who do things who aren't smart, right? So they all cause various problems. So that's really what we look for, and that's something that bridges software development, legal, corporate development, sales. It's true across the whole company. So, other questions?
Yes, one here.
Yeah.
So funnily, Max, you just described my new project. So I have a question regarding cloud computing. So right now we have 2 types of applications. Basically, for example, let's take Gmail or Google Docs, having lighter number of features that are available, that satisfy most of the user, and we have the small, very cheap application. But let's take Gmail. I've been using Gmail for quite a long time. I'm a big fan. And now I think it's time for Gmail to get serious. I want to download all my old stuff from my old Outlook there, and I believe that I would pay for such upgrade or such additional services. And my question is, when the move into cloud computing is going to get very serious, now everyone is going there, is it economically viable to actually add these upgrades and make sure that at least the software is as good on the cloud as it would be on the software?
I think he's asking you,
Oh,
Marissa.
so I thought we could answer
Wales
it
is gonna
in the
answer it.
abstract. I think that, yes, I think that, the one reason or one thing that we really focused on with Gmail was the low-cost infrastructure we have for storing information. And certainly we're able to store information at incredibly low cost and very reliably. And so I think that it's possible, especially with direct consumer payment, for us to allow people to have a lot of storage. And we're seeing this already on Picasa Web, where you can buy 250 gigabytes for roughly, I think, about $250. So you can already pay for that kind of storage upgrade. And we actually think that users should be able to buy space on all of our services in one block, and then have the systems actually figure out how much do you need for your email, how much do you need for your photos, how much do you need for your files. So I think that's a distinct possibility, and we're pretty excited about it. Other questions?
Thank you. Great panel. Marissa, you asked the panel earlier, are we going to see Photoshop and Flash as on the web soon? And for some reason, they didn't say yes. And I'm going to re-ask that question. Maybe the panelists can think about it again. As we move towards empowering users to become creators, from 100 million unique users to 100 million unique creators, designers, makers of media. Don't you think that's obvious that applications as sophisticated as Flash and Photoshop and others will eventually be available on the web for anybody to use and program and make media? Or why not?
I think so long as the general rules of economics govern the software development process of anything, you will first see very, very, very simplistic applications that cater to a very tiny sliver of that need, and then slightly more, and slightly more, and slightly more, and at a certain point, it might be cheap enough to take all that functionality and throw it on the web. There's no technical reason why it's impossible. In fact, there are Photoshop competitors that are available on the web. They're just very low quality, and they will remain low quality until the economic need is there. If someone is really willing to pay the $1,200 for the Creative Suite 4, whatever it is today, in Flash, somebody would have built it overnight. or almost overnight.
I think that one of the things that happened when people moved to the web, we also got a generation more advanced in the kind of photo processing applications that we create. So, whereas Photoshop is still very much in the world of layers and bitmaps and stuff like that, and in Photoshop you might adjust colors in a certain way, the kind of applications people are looking for is just fix the fluorescent lighting problem that was there, and I don't understand that it's a fluorescent lighting problem, or just get rid of that red eye. And so you see applications like Picasa, or even like iPhoto showing up on the web where they're providing for 99% of the user's needs in a way that makes much more sense to them than the professional Photoshop.
Incidentally, just sort of to sharpen this one a little bit, this does not obviate the opportunity for 100 million people to be brilliant, interesting designers. It's just true that 100 million people, 99.99999% of that 100 million people will never learn Photoshop because they don't have the time to do so. So they would very much prefer tools Joel just described because they can be creative and brilliant with the simpler yet powerful tools. At a certain point, even the very tip of that iceberg will
the last of the Mohicans, so to speak, will still be using that application on Windows or Mac.
Okay, well, this has been a great discussion, but we're out of time. So I want to thank our panel for a really great, lively discussion on how things get built.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I want to ask you to stay seated because you still got some more energy here. I hope so.